church family. Pastor Keven Newsome here with a new discipleship study that we're going to do. This is a study that I was thinking about possibly doing as an equipping study in the fall. And I decided to go ahead and present it now to you through video over the next few weeks as we are still trying to navigate our way through some of this isolation. And perhaps I'll do it again in the fall for those who want to get some more insight and have some more discussion concerning what we go over. So this study is called We Are One, and it's about generational influence on the church, past, present, and future. And this study is very special to me. I'm going to tell you a little bit about it. It's a study that I wrote that came out of a discipleship study that I created some years ago at a church, and we went over it as a church together, and it was so popular I was asked to do it in other multiple occasions, and asked repeatedly to write something down, and so that or create some material that the people could have, that I could pass out, or that they could even buy. And so I wound up putting it in book format, which is right here, which you can find this on Amazon. I'll tell you a little bit more about that there, and it's not something that I do for the money. It's just a resource that I was able to compile together after several years of doing research on generational ministry in the church, and so that resource is there. And I want to go over this study with you now over the next few weeks. So we're going to do session 1 today. Let me get this set up. There we go. So We Are One, generational influence on the church, past, present, and future. So to begin, we're going to talk about the importance of generational unity. So 1 Corinthians 12:12 says, "For even as the body is one and yet has many members, all the members of the body, though they are many, are one body, so also is Christ." The church is meant to be unified. The church is meant to work together, and it's not about being like-minded. It's about everybody coming together with their unique perspectives and their unique life experiences, to create something that's really dynamic for the furthering of the kingdom. Unfortunately, we today live in a very intense time of division. And the division is global. Division is everywhere in all facets of life, and we've seen this division affect the church, not just the American church. We see the division globally with the global church and with denominations that are global, such as the Methodist Church. We see a lot of heavy division. We see division along theological lines. We see division along methods, along age groups, ethnicity. The church, unfortunately, is one of the most divided entities on the planet right now, and this is not what it was meant to be. We were meant to be unified, and the biblical model for unity involves generations working together, older generations teaching and empowering younger generations to take over and carry the torch. And we see that particular point as a point of division, in that sometimes some of the older generations don't want the younger generations to take over and carry the torch. But this definitely is biblical. And so I want to read to you Titus 2:2-8. Older men are to be temperate, dignified, sensible, sound in faith and love and perseverance. Older women likewise are to be reverent in their behavior, not malicious gossips, nor enslaved to much wine, teaching what is good, so that they may encourage the young women to love their husbands, to love their children, to be sensible, pure, workers at home, kind, being subject to their own husbands, so that the word of God will not be dishonored. Likewise, urge the young men to be sensible in all things. Show yourselves to be an example of good deeds, with purity in doctrine, dignified, sound in speech, which is beyond reproach, so that the opponent will be put to shame, having nothing hard to say about us. And so we see that the Bible teaches that the church is dependent on generational unity for the passing on of morality, of biblical teaching. We can go to other passages that talk about teaching your children the laws of God and such. The church, body of Christ is meant to be generationally unified. And this requires intentionality, it requires effort, it requires some work on the part of being unified. Now, I do want to pause and take a moment to say here, because the majority of my watchers, viewers here today are probably from the church I'm currently serving, Malvern Hill Baptist Church in Camden, South Carolina. And I do want to say that I'm very blessed to be serving a church that is very unified in lots of different ways, unified in about every way you could think of. And so as I go through this study, I do want my home church to know that this is not something I wanted to do as a way of saying that, hey, you're too divided, you need more unified. That's not the characteristic of this church at all. Malvern Hill is a very unified church, and there are some things in this study I think will be beneficial, and if nothing else, it'll be a good reminder for a lot of people what generational unity looks like. And it's educational, because through this study, everybody can have an opportunity to identify themselves in these generations, and to learn more about themselves, learn more about the people around them, and how their generational placement affects the way they think and affects the way they act. And I think it can only benefit us. Even though Malvern Hill is a very unified church, there are some benefits, and we are going to do a session or two on church cycles, generational cycles, and historical cycles, and having a good understanding of what the generational characteristics are will help us to understand these cycles. And I think these cycles are very important as we seek to prepare the church for the next generations. All right, so that's sort of an overview of what this is all about, and during this study we're going to talk about each individual generation. We're going to talk about their characteristics, their personalities, their strengths, their weaknesses, and how they interact with the church, and how they interact with the other generations. We'll talk about some specific ways to minister to each generation. We'll also talk about how each generation helps to influence and shape the generations to come. And so as we get into this, I want you to be able to identify yourself and your generation, your family, your friends, those around you. I have in front of you right now a timeline of most of the generations we're going to be talking about. These are all the generations that you have probably encountered over the past 100 years or so. The lost generation, there are probably, if there are any of the lost generations still alive, they are about 120 years old. I doubt there are any still living today. The lost generation was 1883 to 1900. These dates are birth dates. These are birth years. So this range of years would be the year they would be born. If you were born in this range of year, that would be technically the generation you belong to. The GI generation was from 1901 to 1927, also known as the greatest generation. We do still have some of the GI generation with us. The silent generation from 1928 to 1945. Then we have the baby boomer generation, 1946 to 1964. Generation X, 1965 to 1982. Millennials, 1983 to 2000. Generation Z, 2001 to 2018. And something very interesting that I noticed as I was preparing this material to share with you today. If you will look at these year ranges, you'll see that most generations cover about 17 to 18 years worth, with the exception of the GI generation, and we all know that GI generation had some very extenuating circumstances during their time. And so their generation is a little bit longer. Their generation is about 26 years long. But most of them stay within 17 to 18 years, which means that as of 2019, we have begun to see the appearance of the next generation. The next generation is being born right now. And so we don't know what that generation is going to look like. Our senior pastor here has suggested that they may be called the COVID generation. We don't know. It all depends on how long this COVID pandemic stretches out, and how many years, how long it takes for us to actually deal with the repercussions from this, if this becomes a defining trait in the formative years of this generation, then that certainly could be a possible name for them. So they have been started being born 2019, 2020, and forward will be the next generation. I'll give you another graphic so that you can see these generations here. Now, as you're looking at this graphic, let me just note the years that are in this graphic. Some of these year breaks, these dividing lines between generations are subjective. Cultural anthropologists disagree on where some of these generations should be divided. They look for different markers, historical markers, economic markers, and other things, technological markers, as things that to give them an anchor to divide a generation from one to the next. But they don't always agree. So what I have done is to take a range of the dividing lines that I was able to locate and find an average. For example, one of the dividing lines that is most disagreed upon is the dividing line between Generation X and the Millennials. I have seen this dividing line as early as 1978, 1979, and as late as 1985. And so I took sort of an average, I took a middle road, and I put it between 1982 and 1983. Another dividing line that has a lot of disagreement is the division between Millennials and Generation Z. We see that go as early as 1995, as late as 2005. 2000 is a good solid marker, and I think that's going to wind up being the date that sticks. So that's a dividing line that I'm using right there. Find yourself, find your friends, find your family members, your children, your parents on this chart. Because moving forward, when we begin to talk about generational characteristics, you're going to want to have an idea of real people in mind that you can compare these characteristics to. And the reason for this is so that you would have a better idea, a better understanding about those generational characteristics and how you can better minister to them. So have an idea where you are. And also, we're going to talk about these dividing lines. Again, these are gray areas. They're not black and white division lines. So there's about a 5-year gray area between. So if you're looking at this, if you're looking at the division line between 1982 and 1983, and you were born on December 31st, 1982, and you don't feel like you're Generation X, and you don't feel like you're a millennial, well, there's a reason for that. You're neither. So cultural anthropologists have begun to identify what they're calling microgenerations. So microgenerations are this 5-year overlap of the generational dividing lines, and those that are born in these microgenerations can exhibit characteristics of both of those adjacent generations. So if you are born between the millennials and Generation X, sometime around that dividing line, within 5 years, you could share characteristics with both generations. So the result becomes a slight disconnect with each generation. You're not fully one generation, you're not fully the other. You have your own unique set of characteristics which are actually a combination of characteristics from the other two. So these microgenerations, for example, xennials, are the first named microgeneration by cultural anthropologists. I am a xennial. Xennials are identified as being somewhere between 1977 and 1982. This 5-year range between Gen X and millennials. Anyone born in that range will not feel, usually doesn't feel like they're Generation X, and they usually don't feel like they're millennial. They feel like there's something slightly different. It's a combination of the characteristics of both. These microgenerations tend to slide with their characteristics depending on the generation they're interacting with. So the xennials will carry some Generation X characteristics, and when they are dealing with Generation X, those Generation X characteristics become elevated. Likewise, they'll have millennial characteristics, and so when they're dealing with millennials, their millennial characteristics will become elevated. When they're dealing with parent generations and children generations, they will deal with they will take on the characteristics more likely to interact with the parent and children generations, according to generation gaps. So we look at generation gaps next. A generation gap is where a parent in one generation is in one generation and the child is 2 generations later. So that's a generation gap. And so we seldom see true generational gaps within family units. This is what I've seen in my own life. I've seen in others in the research that I've done. Those gaps want to close. The gaps don't want to exist. What tends to happen the reason you would usually have a generational gap is that one or the other is going to be born in that 5-year microgeneration area, or one side or the other. So, for example, I am a microgeneration xennial. I am born in between, and I'm in that 5-year overlap between Gen X and millennial. My parents are baby boomers. My children are Generation Z. If you were to look strictly at my birth year, you would call me a Generation X. But because I'm in that gap, I tend to slide one direction or the other. If you call me a Generation X and my children are Generation Z, then there is a generational gap missing in my family. There are no millennials. So what tends to happen, these gaps want to close. Where that gap exists, the one closest to the dividing line, the one born nearest to a generational division, will tend to slide into the missing gap in order to fill those characteristics. So as I am dealing with my parents, even though I have characteristics as a xennial of both millennial and Generation X, as I am interacting with my parents, I tend to, the Generation X characteristics within me tend to become elevated. I tend to act more Gen X when I'm dealing with my baby boomer parents. And as I was growing up, I probably behaved more Gen X because my identity was defined more by my parents during that time, and generation gaps don't want to exist. When I became a parent, my identity began to shift away from my parents to being a parent of my children. Since my children are Generation Z, my millennial characteristics begin to elevate as a parent in order to close the gap so that there is no true generational gap there. I tend to behave more millennial in dealing with my children and their friends. So that's what I mean by the generation can slide in their characteristics one way or the other if they are in that micro-generation area. If there is any kind of gap on either side, they may tend to slide. They could also slide just simply by having to work or interact on a regular basis with someone from an adjacent generation. So when I'm around not just my parents but other baby boomers, I would tend to slide more in the Gen X direction. And when I'm around millennials, when I'm around Generation Z, then I would tend to slide more in that direction in the way my characteristics come out. So that's what we mean by the sliding of characteristics. That's what we mean by generation gaps. That's what we mean by microgenerations. All that to say that if you find yourself within 5 years of a generation dividing line, that does not mean you are hard fixed to the generation where you are literally born within. You are in a micro generation, and like I said, the only one that's been named properly is the Xennials. But every dividing line has its own micro generation that's there. I'm sure that children born 1998, 1999, 2000, 2001, all of these that are around the break between millennials and Gen Z, they don't really feel like millennials. They don't really feel like they're Gen Z. These are, they're about 20, 21 now. They a little older than what we would typically call Gen Z, a little younger than what we would typically call millennial. They don't really fit in. Their microgeneration doesn't have a name yet, but I'm sure it will get a name soon. Culture anthropologists will probably come up with it before long. Let me show you the timeline of generations again. Know where you are, find your spot on it. Know that if you are within 5 years of one of the dividing lines, that you could have characteristics of both, that those characteristics may slide one direction or the other depending on who you're interacting with, depending on your family dynamics in order to close generation gaps. And so as we go through in our next session, we'll begin going through some of the generations, talking about their characteristics, their strengths, their weaknesses, and the way they interact with other generations. As we begin to go through this, if you are in one of these micro generations, and then you may feel like some of it applies to you and some of it doesn't apply. Well, that's because you're going to catch characteristics of more than one generation. So know that, and also know that everybody is unique. Every family is unique. Every region is unique. Just because I throw a characteristic out there of baby boomers and you happen to be a baby boomer, that doesn't mean I'm calling you or naming you or labeling you with that characteristic. I want you to know that what I'm covering covers the entirety of your generation as a whole. The emerging characteristics that have come out of an entire generation. That doesn't always apply to individuals. You're unique. Your characteristics are unique. And you may be a baby boomer and act nothing like the characteristics that I will go over of baby boomers. And that's fine. But when we're dealing with generational archetypes as a whole, then we've got to look at a bigger picture of whole generations and not spend too much time looking at individuals. So these are characteristics that I've researched for entire generations. So know that I'm not trying to single anybody out or apply labels to people as individuals. Everybody is different. Finally, if you do decide you want to have that paperback in your hand or have this resource material to be able to read on your own and to go through some of this and to highlight and study it on your own, this is available on Amazon. There's the Amazon link, the ISBNs. If you ordered it from Amazon, it's going to be $12. There's a Kindle version as well that's $3. I have a limited supply at home that I will give you for $10. That's just to cover the shipping and printing costs. I don't make any money off of this book. I never intended to make any money off of this book. And if you want the PDF, I will gladly give you that PDF for free. Let me know, and I will email it to you just as soon as you watch this. Just email it. I'll send you the PDF for free. But do know that I do have limited supply at home, and I can get those to you pretty quickly. I don't make anything off of this. This was not for making money. This is strictly a reference, a resource for you as we talk through these generations. So that was the end of session 1. The next session, I'll go over the first 2 generations on the list. I believe we're going to cover the silent generation and the baby boomers. I don't believe we're going to really talk too much about the GI generation. Talk about mostly about the generations that are currently serving in the church, the ones that are influencers in the church, and the ones that will be setting the tone and laying the foundation for the future of the church. Those are the ones we're going to go over the most. We'll be going over specific generations in session 2 next week, so I hope you enjoyed it. If you have any questions, let me know. You can email them to me. That would be the simplest thing. Email them to me. And I'll get those answers out to you. And if you want to start a group discussion, you're welcome to start a group discussion as well. I'll answer questions on the Facebook group. Keep in mind that's not the Facebook page, but the Facebook group. We can have some discussion there if you would like. So thank you for watching, and I will see you next week with session 2.